Imagine this. A group of prisoners surrounded on all sides, trapped with nowhere to go. The guards are closing in, alarms blaring through the night. And then, out of nowhere, they do something absolutely insane. But before we get to that, let's rewind a bit. Welcome back, detectives. Today's case is one of the most legendary prison escapes in history, Alcatraz. A place designed to be inescapable, a fortress surrounded by freezing waters and deadly currents. And yet, against all odds, a few men dared to challenge it. Before we dive into how they pulled off this impossible feat, make sure to subscribe for more thrilling cases like this one. Our story begins with one man, Frank Morris. If anyone could break out of Alcatraz, it was him. Born into a tough life, Frank had been in and out of prison since he was a teenager. But he wasn't just another criminal, he was a genius. With an IQ of 133, he was smarter than most of the guards keeping him locked up. He had already escaped from multiple prisons before, which is exactly why he was sent to Alcatraz, the so-called inescapable prison. But for Frank, that word didn't mean much. At Alcatraz, he met 3 other inmates, the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, and another prisoner named Alan West. They weren't just any criminals. The Anglin brothers had spent their whole lives running from the law, escaping from juvenile centers and breaking into banks. They were skilled swimmers too, an important detail for what was to come. The 4 of them didn't meet by accident. Frank, the mastermind, saw something in them. He saw an opportunity, and together they started planning the unthinkable, escaping from Alcatraz. But how do you escape from a prison built in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by freezing, deadly waters? That's exactly what we're about to find out. Back in 1956, a man named Frank Lee Morris arrived at Alcatraz. Now, if you're picturing some average prisoner, erase that image. This guy was a certified genius. His IQ was reportedly 133, higher than most people's. But Frank wasn't just book smart, he was street smart too. A lifetime of bouncing between foster homes had made him tough, independent, and, most importantly, really, really good at escaping from prison. Before Alcatraz, Frank had already broken out of multiple facilities. Authorities thought, all right, let's send him to the most escape-proof prison on Earth. You can guess how that turned out. Now, here's where things get interesting. Inside Alcatraz, Frank wasn't alone. He met the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence. These 2 were practically born to escape. As kids, they swam in ice-cold rivers for fun, which would later be very useful. Then there was Alan West, a small-time criminal who, let's be honest, wasn't exactly the brains of the operation, but he played his part. Together they had one goal: breaking out of the rock, and trust me, their plan was nothing short of genius. As the days in Alcatraz dragged on, Morris wasn't just biding his time. He was observing, thinking, and planning. He had spent his entire life slipping through the cracks of society, evading law enforcement, and finding ways out of impossible situations. If there was anyone who could escape the rock, it was him. But even a mastermind like Frank Morris knew he couldn't do it alone. And that's where the Anglin brothers came in, John and Clarence. These 2 weren't just any criminals. They were practically born for an escape like this. Raised in Florida, they had spent their childhood swimming in rivers with powerful currents, which would be crucial for what was to come. They were skilled bank robbers, but more importantly, they were thick as thieves, literally. They had an unshakable bond, a kind of trust that only brothers who had spent their entire lives side by side could have. Then there was the 4th member of the crew, Alan West. Unlike Morris and the Anglins, West wasn't exactly an expert in escape artistry, but what he lacked in skill, he made up for with something just as important: access. West worked as a maintenance man inside the prison, which meant he knew the layout, the weak points, and where to find the tools they would need. And so, the dream team was assembled. Frank Morris, the mastermind, the brains of the operation; John and Clarence Anglin, the tough, resourceful brothers with the physical endurance to make the escape possible; Alan West, the man with the inside knowledge, the one who could get them what they needed. But here's the thing. Escaping Alcatraz wasn't just about slipping past the guards. The prison was surrounded by the freezing, choppy waters of the San Francisco Bay, with currents strong enough to pull even the best swimmers to their deaths. And even if they made it out of their cells, they still had to deal with floodlights, armed watchtowers, and steel bars thicker than a man's wrist. Most prisoners wouldn't even dream of trying, but Morris, he didn't just dream about it, he knew it could be done. And so in December 1961, they got to work. The plan was insane, borderline suicidal, but then again, so was trying to survive in Alcatraz. The first problem: the cells themselves. Each man had to carve a hole behind the air vents in their cells, big enough to crawl through. They couldn't just start hacking away at the walls like cartoon characters tunneling to freedom. No, they had to be quiet, careful, and patient. Every night, for 6 months straight, they would chip away at the concrete using makeshift tools. Things like spoons stolen from the cafeteria and metal from an old saw blade. And here's where it gets even crazier. To hide their progress, they created fake vent covers out of cardboard and painted them to match the walls. From a distance, they looked identical to the real ones. The guards had no idea. But chipping away the wall was just step one. They needed a place to hide once they squeezed through. Lucky for them, behind their cells was an unguarded utility corridor, a space filled with pipes and vents that led straight up to the roof. It was perfect. So, every night after a full day of acting like normal prisoners, they would crawl through their makeshift holes into the corridor, where they continued their work. They set up a secret workshop there, yes, a full-on workshop inside Alcatraz, where they built the key to their escape, a homemade raft. And this is where the plan got truly insane. A raft wasn't something you could just steal from the prison. They had to make it themselves. So what did they do? They collected more than 50 raincoats, yes, raincoats, stolen from fellow prisoners or scavenged from around the prison. They carefully stitched them together, using heat from a pipe to melt the rubber and seal the seams. The result? A makeshift but watertight raft, along with life vests to keep them afloat in the deadly bay waters. And if that wasn't crazy enough, they even built paddles, out of scrap wood. But even with all that in place, the hardest part was yet to come, getting out of their cells without being noticed. And for that, they had one last trick up their sleeves: dummy heads. Yeah, you heard that right. These guys went full Hollywood and made fake heads out of soap, toilet paper, and hair stolen from the prison barber. They painted them to look as lifelike as possible, then placed them on their pillows at night. That way, when the guards walked by during bed checks, it would look like they were fast asleep. If one thing went wrong, just one thing, they would be caught, thrown into solitary confinement or worse. But they weren't backing down. The pieces were in place. The plan was almost ready. And soon, the real escape would begin. As the plan took shape, the prisoners knew they needed to make sure their absence wouldn't be detected too soon. If the guards realized they were missing before they had enough time to escape the island, it would all be over. So they came up with a clever trick: dummy heads. Morris and the Anglin brothers crafted incredibly realistic fake heads out of soap, toilet paper, and even hair they had collected from the prison barbershop. The idea was simple. Each night, they would place the heads on their pillows, making it seem like they were asleep. This would buy them precious extra hours before the alarm was raised. By early June 1962, everything was in place. The prisoners had spent months carefully widening the holes in their cells, making sure to hide the progress behind cardboard and paint during the day. They had fashioned a makeshift raft out of stolen raincoats, stitching and gluing them together to form something that could, hopefully, keep them afloat. The night of June 11, 1962, was the moment of truth. The men silently removed the grates covering their escape tunnels, crawled through the holes, and made their way into the unguarded utility corridor behind their cells. This was the part where they had to move quickly and quietly. One mistake, one loud noise, and it was all over. One by one they climbed up to the roof of the cell block, navigating the maze of pipes and vents. They moved like shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they reached the top, they slipped through a vent and emerged onto the roof of the prison. At this point, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of what they were doing. Alcatraz wasn't just some run-down jail with lazy guards. It was one of the most secure prisons in the world, and yet, here they were, crawling over its rooftops like something out of a Hollywood movie. But they weren't safe yet. They still had to scale a 15-foot fence topped with barbed wire and make it to the shore without being spotted. The moment they set foot outside the prison walls, they knew there was no turning back. And then, just as they thought they had made it, something unexpected happened. The red beacon from the lighthouse was the only thing piercing through the darkness, flashing over the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. The three men were now in the water, surrounded by the bone-chilling cold and the relentless waves. There was no turning back now. Frank Morris was the first to push forward, kicking against the current as he held on to their makeshift raft. It was crude, just raincoats, stitched together and stuffed with air, but it was their only hope. The Anglin brothers followed closely behind, their breath coming in sharp gasps as the icy water drained their strength. As they drifted away from Alcatraz, the reality of their situation set in. The cold was unbearable. Every muscle in their bodies screamed for warmth, but they couldn't stop. The tide was unpredictable, and if they hesitated, they could be swept out into the open ocean. Then came the real challenge, navigating the darkness. There were no lights to guide them, only the distant glow of the city, shimmering like a promise just out of reach. They knew that if they didn't reach land soon, their bodies would give in to the cold. At one point, John Anglin thought he saw something in the water, a dark shape moving beneath the surface. A shark? No, probably just his imagination playing tricks on him. But fear had a way of creeping in when you were at your weakest. They paddled with everything they had, their movements growing sluggish. Minutes felt like hours. Had they made a mistake? Had they underestimated the bay's deadly grip? And then, nothing. The raft, the prisoners, gone. By the time the sun rose, the waters were empty. The only sign of the escape was a few pieces of raincoat material found drifting near Angel Island. But as for the men themselves, it was as if they had vanished into the abyss. What really happened to them? Did they make it to shore, slipping into the city to start a new life? Or did the bay claim them, dragging them down into the cold depths? One thing was certain. Alcatraz was never the same after that night. Just as the authorities thought they had uncovered every piece of the puzzle, a new lead emerged. A fisherman came forward, claiming he had seen a makeshift raft floating in the bay the night of the escape. At first, the police dismissed it as a mere coincidence, perhaps just debris floating in the strong currents. But when they found a piece of plywood with makeshift paddles washed up near Angel Island, their suspicions reignited. Meanwhile, investigators kept receiving scattered reports. A woman in South America swore she had met a man who looked eerily similar to Frank Morris. Another claimed she had received a postcard signed with only the initials J.A., the same as John Anglin. Some even speculated that the escapees had changed their identities and blended into society, living quiet lives far away from the reach of the law. And then, in 2013, an astonishing letter surfaced. It was allegedly written by John Anglin himself, stating that he and his brother had indeed survived, and that Frank Morris had passed away in 2008. The letter offered a deal. If the authorities promised medical treatment, John would turn himself in. But by the time investigators attempted to verify the claims, the trail had gone cold once again. To this day, the mystery remains unsolved. Some believe they perished in the icy waters of San Francisco Bay, their bodies lost to the currents. Others insist they outsmarted the system and vanished into the shadows, living out the rest of their days as free men. What do you think, detectives? Did they make it, or was their escape doomed from the start? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this investigation, don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling mysteries. Until next time, stay sharp, detectives.